All right, so check this out. What I got in my hand right here is the text of an actual letter that was found in the wall of an old house in New Hampshire, okay? This old widow used to live in the house, and a few years after she had left, they were knocking down the building, and they found this guy sitting in the stonework of the wall. The letter is dated May the 9th, 1845, and here's a couple of my favorite lines. I have borne with you till my patience is all gone. I cannot find words bad enough to express what I feel. You black devils you are. Now, spirits of the bottomless pit, depart from this place with all speed. We are preparing water to drown you, fire to roast you, cats to catch you, and clubs to maul you. All right, so what is this letter, right? Like, who is this supposed to be addressed to? Why is it in the wall? What's the deal here? Well, this letter is actually born out of a very long-standing and storied superstition that has basically been completely forgotten about nowadays. You see, back in the day, if you were having rodent problems, you didn't need to worry about getting poison or traps or a cat or a rat terrier or any of that kind of stuff. All you needed was a pen and a piece of paper. You just sit down at your kitchen table and you write those rats a letter explaining, hey, you guys, you're bugging me. You got to get out of here. Then you fold that up, you stick it in a hole in the wall, and boom, you're done. The rats are going to read that bad boy and be out of your house by the end of the day. So this is just one of those little bits of folklore that's just like so much fun, right? So with the aid of my big binder full of rat letters here, let me take you on a journey into the magical world of 19th century folklore. Oh, and before I get too deep into this, I should probably mention that this is another one of those topics on this channel where we're just kind of floating into uncharted waters, right? Like, as far as I can tell, nobody now really knows or cares too much about this. Like, every source I got in here is like 80, 90 years old minimum. And the only reason I know about it is because I read it in this old book from 1947 about New England folklore that I've been thumbing through, right? So ever since I found out about this, I've just been doing my best to pull together as many old accounts of this tradition as I could find, right? So let's get at her. So my collection here is from all sorts of old books on folklore and newspaper articles and magazines and farmers' digests and almanacs and all sorts of stuff like that, right? And each of these sources sort of like details their own version of what a letter to a rat looks like. And one thing you'll notice when you're going through these stories is that they tend to follow like certain templates. Like there's a lot of like, there's little tropes that show up in these letters and these stories that you'll see again and again and again. So what I really want to do with this video is sort of like teach you how to write your own letter to a rat in case you're having a rat problem. But before I do that, I just want to give you like a basic example of how these rat stories tend to go, okay? So I found this particular story in an old women's magazine based in Philadelphia called Arthur's Ladies' Home Magazine. And this particular issue was published in April of 1871. Basically, this magazine is just a collection of stories that were sent in from women all around the country for other women to read, right? And all these stories are supposedly true. Like, this is stuff that actually happened to the authors. Now, this particular article is appropriately titled, Writing a Letter to the Rats. And it's basically just a story that the author heard from an old woman over the summer, right? And the story goes a little like this. So long ago, there was a farmhouse out on the countryside, right? And there was a large family who lived there who were like super into baking. They baked pies and cakes and bread and whatever. And they stored all those goods that they baked down in the cellar, right? And one day, the mom sent one of the kids down into the cellar to get something. And the kid comes running back up the stairs and says, hey, all our stuff is gone. So the family rushes down to the cellar, they look around and they realize, the rats have to be responsible for this one. We got to deal with this problem. So they start thinking and they come to the conclusion that they can't just plug up the hole because the rats will make a new hole, and they've tried traps in the past and that didn't work, so we're not going to do that either. The only thing we can really do here is write a letter to the rats and ask them politely to leave. Now, this suggestion comes from Grandma, who says that she's done this in the past and it actually worked. Now, remember this. This is going to be important for later. Now, we don't have the exact text for this particular letter, but we do got the gist of it, right? Basically, they just said, hey, just a heads up, we already got a lot of mouths to feed. We're not really going to be able to take care of you guys. Maybe you should head down to Cedar Swamp. I heard that's a real nice place. Don't bother going to our neighbors, though. They don't have a lot of room either. So, you know, just so you know, it might be a good idea to move on. So they got their letter right, and they fold it up. They're about to stick it in the hole, and Grandma says, hey, wait a minute. we got to put some grease on that letter, because otherwise, how are the rats going to find it? You know, the grease is how we'll attract the rats to our letter. And wouldn't you know it, the rats actually leave. They're gone. The letter worked. All right, so we got our basic rat letter story, right? Now it's time to start dissecting this tradition. So remember I told you to remember that it was Grandma who suggested to write the letter? Well, this is like maybe the single most common trope in all of these stories. Like 90% of the time, it's an old woman that has the idea to do this. Like, it's not always a family member. Sometimes it's like a traveling old woman or a neighbor or something like that, but it's almost always an elderly lady. Like, here's one in another magazine called St. Nicholas, March 1889. This one's got a really nice picture of the rats reading the letter. Basically, this family keeps losing beefsteak in the cellar, and a mysterious old peddler woman comes up and tells them, hey, when I was living back in Germany and we had rats, we'd just write them a letter and they'd leave. Here's another one, 1888, from the Orleans County Monitor in Vermont. And it's an old neighbor lady this time that tells the family, you got to write your rats a letter or you're never going to solve this problem. Here's an Oregon magazine from 1900, and wouldn't you know it, it's an old lady again telling them to write the letter. And by the way, when it's not some like old traveling wise woman or like a clever matriarch, it's a young woman instead. Like in this one, another magazine called The Scrapbook in 1906. It's a man writing the story this time. He's got trouble with rats in his basement. And this time, instead of an old lady, it's his daughter and his friend's daughter who come up with the idea to write the rat letter. In this one, another newspaper article from 1883, it's the daughter of a general who is the friend of an author. Just to really hammer this home, in all of these stories that I found, I only found one instance of it being a man who had the idea to do this. And it's in memoirs that a woman wrote about her early life growing up in a farmhouse. She says that her Uncle Jimmy one time wrote a letter to rats to tell them to get out of his cellar. Oh, and by the way, I should probably mention, although we know for sure, like without a doubt, that people actually believed and did this, a lot of these stories, it's kind of hard to separate, folk traditional stories from actual stuff that happened, right? So some of these probably actually happened. Some of them are just folk tales that keep getting passed down from generation to generation. And we really can't tell the difference, but that's kind of the fun with this kind of stuff, right? All right, so now you might be wondering, where did all these traveling old women and neighbors and matriarchs learn this stuff from? Well, again, it kind of depends on who you ask. So we've already got the German example, which I told you about earlier, and I found a couple other stories that mention Germany too, but sometimes it's also a Dutch superstition, and sometimes it's even more vague than that, right? Like, here's a newspaper from Washington, D.C. in 1891 that says that this superstition has been traced to the beginning of the Christian era. So it's super old, right? But it gets even older than that. Like this one here is probably my very favorite origin story out of all of them. This newspaper article from 1897 claims that this tradition was first started up in ancient Greece. The Greeks had a peaceable and gentlemanly method of dealing with mice that is rather unique. When a cellar or granary was overrun with mice, the Greek superstition dictated that a letter be written in large, readable, ancient Greek characters with these words: I adjure you, you mice, now present, neither to injure me nor to let others do so. I give you yonder field. So the guy here is giving the mice a new home, a field over there. And if I ever catch you here, I swear by the mother of the gods, I will tear you into 7 pieces. And since we're reading letters here, why don't we move on to like the exact wording of these letters, right? Because there's all sorts of little trends that you can identify and pull out of the specific wording in these letters. Oh, and by the way, sometimes we have the exact diction of these letters, and sometimes it's more just like a description of what the letter said. So first I should say that these letters kind of fall into 2 categories, angry and cordial. Like that one we read at the top of the video is definitely in the angry category, and this Greek one is more in the angry side of things. And there's plenty more angry ones too. Like this one here is probably one of my favorites out of all of them. It's actually a rhyming note. It was printed in the Los Angeles Herald in 1909. It goes like this: a letter to the rats. I sit down a letter your ratship to write, which I trust you will read and seek refuge in flight. For my patience exhausted by noise and by racket, I warn that a bullet shall pierce each gray jacket. if you and your tribe do not leave on the morrow. Poison rank I will scatter, and great cats will borrow. In earnest I am, now take heed to my warning. Get order by midnight, and leave here by morning. Farewell and good riddance, they say by the wharf. You will find food in plenty. Now scamper, be off. In my pantry or cellar, neither do it dare appear, for I am your enemy, true and sincere. All right, so we got some angry letters for sure, but most of the time these are a lot more cordial, right? Like there's a lot of bargaining, like explaining your point of view to the rats, saying that you're looking out for their best interest, stuff like that, right? Like this one here from Maine, 1888. Messrs. Rats and Co. Having taken quite a deep interest in your welfare in regard to your winter quarters, I thought I would drop you a few lines, which might be of some considerable benefit to you in the future. Seeing that you have pitched your winter quarters at the summer residence of number 1 Seaview Street, I wish to inform you that you will be very much disturbed during cold winter months, as I am expecting to be at work through all parts of the house, shall take down ceilings, take up floors, and clean out every substance that would serve to make you comfortable. Likewise, there will be nothing left for you to feed on, as I shall remove each eatable substance. So you had better take up your abode elsewhere. I shall do you no harm if you heed to my advice, but if not, I shall employ rough on rats. So the majority of these letters are actually more like this, right? They're relatively cordial. But the one most pivotal thing that you have to include if a rat letter, if you're writing a nice one, is a place for the rats to go instead of your house. This is absolutely crucial. Because these rats, they're not just going to leave out of the kindness of their hearts, right? Like, they got to look out for themselves and their families. So you got to give them another place to go, somewhere where they can be even happier. And like we've seen, sometimes the alternative place that this letter offers is a swamp or a field or somewhere natural like that, right? But most of the time, these letters actually just completely sell out a neighbor. Like, oh, go over to my neighbor Bob's house. He's actually got a whole ton of great potatoes in his basement. Oh, there's actually like this French family down the street. They're really good cooks. You should go check them out. They've got the good stuff, not me. Like, here's a newspaper article, 1888. I will write a letter to the rats, and I know just the place to send them, to Joe Blake's Blue Chest. So now they're naming their neighbors, like specifically, like, no, go over to that guy, bother him, don't bother me. Rats, if you do not get out of the house and go to John Grant's, I will set a trap or poison you. My favorite, though, is when they give specific addresses. Like, I will here refer you to the farm of number 6 Incubator Street, where you will find a splendid cellar well filled with vegetations of all kinds. Yeah, head over to number 65 Pearl Street. I don't have anything for you. Just go over there. They won't mind. Doesn't this kind of bring up like a moral quandary? Like, if you were 100% certain that this worked, like if you had rats in your house and you knew with certainty that if you wrote them a letter and told them to go to a neighbor's house that they would go bother your neighbor instead, would you still do it? Oh, and one last thing before we move on here. Here's my favorite little story which shows the dichotomy between the angry letters and the cordial letters. So remember that that family that needed help from the mysterious old German woman earlier in the video, right? Well, after the German woman told the family to write a letter, this is the first letter that they wrote. To the boss rat, get out of our cellar at once. We hired this house for ourselves, and you have no business to make yourselves at home, living here and stealing our provisions. If you do not heed this warning, we will keep a terrier and make it very lively for you. Yours angrily, the people of this house. And after the family wrote this letter, they folded it up and they stuck it in the cellar, and wouldn't you know it, the rats didn't even pay any attention to it at all. They stuck around, didn't bother them one little bit. So when the German woman came back, they said, hey, we tried your method and it didn't work at all. The rats are still here. So she asked to see the letter that they wrote, and they showed it to her, and she was horrified. Oh dear, 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 what an impudent letter to send to the rats. It is a mercy they haven't attacked some of the people in the house and bitten them in their beds. I could not sleep a wink in a house where such a letter had been sent to the rats. Why, rats are kings in their way. At least they are in Germany. They must be treated very politely. Tell your parents to write another letter at once, and let it be soft and gentle and very respectful. Call them dear rats or dear friends, and find no fault with what they do. Only be sure to recommend some other place for them to go. And so the family wrote a new letter. Dear rats, we have discovered signs of your presence in our cellar. Perhaps you mean to honor us and pay us a compliment in coming to this particular cellar in a city where there are hundreds of thousands of such resorts. It may be news to you that there lives not far away a French family, much given to rich gravies, sweet meats, delightful pastries, rare and high-scented imported cheese, and various other luxuries of which we know you to be fond. If you should go there, you would fare much better than in our cellar. So they sent that letter off to the rats, and wouldn't you know it, that didn't work either. So the German woman came by again, and they said, hey, this new nice letter didn't work either. And you know what she said? She said, well, I kind of think you pissed him off so bad with that first letter that you're never going to be able to repair this relationship. And then just to really rub salt in the wound, she tacked on that maybe the American rats are just a little bit ruder than German rats, so that's why writing them a letter doesn't work. But all right, so now you've got your letter written right. It's very nice, very cordial, very understanding of the rats' needs. And you let the rats know that, hey, there's a better place for you to go just down the street. Just head down there, you'll have a much better time. It's a win-win for both of us, right? But now you gotta ask, how can I get these rats to read the letter? Well, as we've already seen, the most important thing is to put some grease or lard on it to attract the rats. This shows up in almost every single story that I found. Like, this is an absolute constant. It's a necessity, right? But even beyond that, another very important thing is to not put the letter in an envelope, right? Because even though rats can read, they just can't open envelopes. So you got to make sure that they can actually get at your little note. And you should be all good, right? You got your letter, you folded it up, it's greased up, it's not in an envelope. Shove that bad boy in a crack in the wall and you're all good. But now the question comes, does it actually work? Well, sometimes no, like we saw with the German lady, and here's another example, 1896, where it didn't work. But in the majority of these little folk tales, it totally works. The letter was laid on the lower cellar stair one night. Next day, the rats had disappeared and were seen no more. Sure enough, the rats left, and we have had not one around the place since the letter was placed under the sidewalk. And then the funniest feature of these versions of the story where the rats actually leave is that sometimes the neighbor who you sent the rats to will show up at your door and be like, what's going on? I got a bunch of rats in my house now. Like this one here where they sent the rats to their neighbor, Mr. Blake. And a few days later, their neighbor's at their door asking if they can borrow their rat trap because he's got an infestation in his basement, right? Oh, and here's one of the funniest little anecdotes too. I even read one story here, a newspaper article from 1883, where apparently one farmer sent rats to his neighbor and his neighbor got all mad about it and started a years-long quarrel where the two neighbors were just sending the rats back and forth, writing letters back and forth, trying to convince the little rodents that, oh no, actually that guy's house is much better. Hey, what are you doing back here? I already told you, my neighbor's house is so much better. Oh, and here's another great trope. I found this in two separate accounts. Sometimes after you write a letter to the rats and tell them to leave, if you stay up late at night and look out your window, you'll see the rats prancing down the road in the moonlight off to their new home that you just recommended. Oh, and here's one more little detail I found a few times that I really, really think is funny. So sometimes if the letter works and the rats leave, the members of the family, the household will be like, even though this worked, I really just can't believe that the rats are able to read, right? Like there's no way they actually read this letter and took our advice. What I think happened is they saw the letter all greased up sitting on the floor and they took that as a sign of war. And they realized that we're declaring war on them. So they just got out of there ahead of time so they wouldn't get caught up in this big battle, right? That's much more reasonable. And that, I think, is just about everything I got on the tradition of writing letters to rats. So I hope you learned something from this video. Next time you're having trouble with those little rodents, don't worry. Just get out a pen and a piece of paper. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.